In this last module on memory, Module E, we're going to talk about the brain at the beginning and some of the parts of the brain that are responsible for our memory loss. And then we're going to get into how we can improve our memory, some of the techniques and ideas. And I also want to encourage you to check out a link that I've provided on eLearn, which I'll talk about a little bit more, where you can do some things to see how well you can change your memory and your ability to remember things. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk about what part of the brain. The most important part of the brain when it comes to our memories is the hippocampus. This is where our memories are stored. Now, this you may think that, is that the only part of the brain? But it's not, obviously. Much of our brain is used for memories. In fact, when people have had parts of the brain removed, we found out just exactly how much of our brains are used for memory. One of the other major pieces that's not shown in this particular diagram, but is also an important part of our memory, is the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is responsible mostly for our memories of emotional events. So, in other words, there is some kind of emotional tie to a memory that helps us to keep or retain that memory. It may be good emotion, it may be a bad emotion. For instance, some people have said that perfumes can trigger memories. And a friend of mine was telling me about a time shortly after her mother passed away that she was in the mall and smelled this perfume, this strong scented perfume that was very similar to what her mother used to use on a regular basis. And she followed a woman for about maybe over 2 or 3 stores before she realized what she was doing. And then she realized that can't be her mother, obviously, because her mother had passed. But it was such a powerful feeling of memory towards her mother that she did this. So what happens when we have damage to our brain? How does that affect our ability to remember things? Well, I want to talk about anterograde amnesia, and in particular, the story of H.M. H.M. Was a man who had had severe epileptic seizures. They were so bad that they had identified the part of the brain where the seizures were occurring and decided that the best thing to do to sort of relieve his epileptic seizures was to remove part of the temporal lobe, the amygdala, and the hippocampus region. And so what happened was that as a result of this surgery, he was able to maintain his intelligence. He was stable and his seizures were reduced. So all these are really positive things that you would think, well, it's a good thing that he did this. However, there was one that was quite negative, and that is his lack of ability to store new information. So his short-term memory was still as good as ever, and he usually remembered the events that happened, but he was not able to remember a single event that occurred from the surgery to 56 years later. He lived his life as if he was still 27 years old. He couldn't form those new memories, and he was still living his life as if he was 27. Now, one thing that they do know, though, is that he was still able to store facts, but he was able to form non-declarative memories. That is, he could still acquire skills. He learned to play tennis. Unfortunately, he didn't have knowledge of learning to play tennis, but he did learn as a result. Another interesting case that your textbook discusses is KC. And he is able to remember nothing that he's ever done. He can't remember himself experiencing situations, participating in events. He couldn't remember recalling anything. And you would think he had a very severe case of amnesia. But basically, his episodic memory was erased, but his semantic memory, or memory for knowledge, was intact. He still had a really wide knowledge of geography, history, politics, whatever it was that he was really interested in before his accident. In this case, he was in a severe motorcycle accident where he had a head trauma. So what we know then is that once stored, memories can be retrieved without the involvement of the hippocampus. But it seems that depending on where your brain is injured, you may have the phenomenon known as anterograde amnesia, which will affect your ability to form long-term memories. And again, this is not a normal person. This is a person who's either had some kind of head trauma, had surgery as a result of seizures, and so forth. So it really depends on what part of the brain a person has injury, how badly it will affect their memories. Short-term memory loss is the most common for most people who have had some sort of head trauma, motor vehicle accident, so forth. I mentioned before my brother had been in a serious accident where he was hit at his temporal lobe on the left side, damaging his optic nerve, and he also had damage to his amygdala and his hippocampus, meaning that his memories for short term are challenging, short-term incidents. Another interesting phenomenon that we have been looking at is going deeper into our brain at the pathways, the neural pathways. So as we talked about when we talked about the brain way back when, long-term potentiation is that idea of being able to strengthen our neural pathways. And how do we do that? We strengthen them by reformatting our memories, if you will, or re-evaluating them. So for instance, let's say you had some kind of negative traumatic experience happen to you as a child, and you are thinking about it and dwelling on it, and it affects your ability to maybe move forward. Sometimes you have bad feelings about yourself because of the way you were treated or what have you. You can actually rewire those memories in a way that involves making new connections to the frontal lobe. So in other words, using your prefrontal cortex of your brain to see it in a more logical way than in the emotional brain that has stored that image. And by doing that, it will have less of a negative impact on you. It's not to say you will forget the memory. It's not to say that it will go away. But what it might do is it might help you to more efficiently get on with the things that are happening in your life. And this is really important, especially when we think about things like our long-term memory and our ability to learn. If these kinds of things get in the way, then it's sort of to our advantage to find a way to, think about how can I turn this negative thing into something less impactful by looking at it in a more logical way. And it takes time and effort, and sometimes it takes the help of another person, such as the therapist, to help you distance yourself from that emotional memory that you may have had. But there's the interesting thing about this whole long-term potentiation is looking at how we can help people who have had memory loss by helping them to strengthen the pathways at the neuron level. And that's what long-term potentiation is all about. So let's talk about improving memory, because I think that this is something that you probably could find very useful in your life right now. What is it that you do to try and remember, for instance, the information for this chapter or for earlier chapters that we had to read before the 5-week break? What happens? How do you keep those memories in your mind? Some people do something like reading it over and over and over again, right? You may sit there and sort of try to memorize it. We call this overlearning, because what you're doing basically is keep looking at something and keep looking at it and looking at it. And sometimes that is useful, but often it's very passive. What do I mean by it's very passive? Well, if you can read a textbook and start asking yourself questions, why does this connect to this? Why does that connect to some previous knowledge that I have? Like, for instance, when we're talking about this in this chapter, we're talking about the brain. If you can connect it to the previous chapter that we had on the brain, you can sort of see how at the neuron levels and at the regions of the brain level, we are able to make that connection to previous knowledge and hopefully help us to understand this new knowledge that we're getting through this chapter. The other thing that helps a lot of people is to find a method of organizing themselves. So, and I don't just mean, like having a calendar and saying, this is when this is due, when this is when that is due, although that's very useful and it's very helpful. But it's sort of trying to put things into categories. And I'll use a simple example like grocery shopping. I sometimes do this when I go to the grocery store. I try to imagine where things are in the store when I'm making my list. So for instance, I'll say, okay, when I come in the doors, like the first place I go see is the produce section. What do I need from the produce section? I need some lettuce, I need some peas, I need some green beans or what have you. So those kinds of things you're sort of organizing, and then you sort of think beyond that. You go and you look at what's the next area of the store that you will come in contact with. So maybe the bakery area or the dairy area, and you can say what you need there, and then the meat area. And so you've organized this, and it helps you to sort of visualize and see what it is you need to remember to get in the grocery store. And this is really useful if you've forgotten your list, which I've done many times. You can sort of look at the sections and think about what I normally buy and what I normally eat. And sometimes I buy more than I need without a list, but sometimes I'm pretty accurate on what I need because I've sort of organized it by category. The third point on this slide that I want to talk about is this mass practice versus space practice. And mass practice is the way the typical student probably studies. You may know it as cramming. So mass practice, think AKA cramming. You basically study like crazy the day before your test. You hope that you're going to be able to retain all of that stuff because you're putting it all in there the day before or even a couple of hours before. Space practice, on the other hand, is where you spend a little bit of time every day with what you've learned that particular day. Or if you don't have your time every day, at least at the end of every week, you can sit down and say, okay, what did I learn this week? What's important about it? What might I be tested on? How can I organize this information? How can I be be prepared for future tests and so forth? So as you can see, mass practice, you're sort of relying on jamming in a lot of information all at once, whereas with spacing it out, you can keep looking at it, but not as much. So for instance, the first time you look at it, you might have to, sort of look at it a lot, and then less the next time, and then less the next time, and so forth, until you really have a deeper level of understanding of that particular issue. So we talked a little bit about connecting to previous knowledge, so I won't really go into that right now. But I do want to talk about this last point on this particular slide, and that is testing your memory. You can go to I've provided a link on eLearn where you can go and you can try different techniques that, and they make it like a little game where you look at some pictures and you have to sort of close your computer and see how much of those pictures you remember. And they tell you different ways of how to remember it, how make it easier for yourself to remember. And so it's a way of sort of learning by doing some new techniques. So please do try that. Okay, the last memory thing I'd like to talk about is mnemonic devices. And mnemonic devices are simply tools. They're tools that we use to help us remember things that may or may not be important. So in this case, we have a picture of an acronym, HOMES, to help us remember the Great Lakes. It's something you may have had to do in elementary school, is to remember the names of the Great Lakes. Now, of course, they're not in order, but you do remember the lakes by remembering those first letters. So you use HOMES and you say, oh yeah, Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, Superior. Or BEDMAS for mathematical formulas. And this is very useful because it's quick, it's easy, it's something that you can use to help you understand a concept. And you have, everybody has them for different tools, for different subjects that they use. I've had nurses speak to me about how they use it for taking blood or for giving needles and so forth. I've even noticed actually in the hospital that some nurses, and I asked a nurse one time why she had these different colored beads, and she said it was a reminder to herself about different blood types. Interesting. Anyways, the other thing that some people do is they make up rhymes. The 30 Days Has September rhyme, for instance, about trying to remember which months have 30 days and which months have more than 30 days and so forth. And so you have a little rhyming song that you go through to help you remember how many days are in that particular month. Method of loci is a little bit different in terms of how you use a mnemonic device, but basically what the method of loci says is that you want to remember where things are. So you might put something in a sequence, and you might visualize seeing that and thinking about it. So for instance, you have to go from your garage to your house to get in the car. You have to go from your car, sorry, other way around, from your house to your garage to get in your car, and you may think about all the things that you need to do in terms of tasks that you might have, and you might think of one task on the stairs and another task in the cupboard where you get your coat and another task on the front step and so on and so forth. And so you have it all sort of remembered. And then when you get to where you need to be, you sort of visualize that. You go back and you try and think, what did I have at the stairs? What did I have at the closet? And so forth, so that you remember all the pieces that you have to remember. The final one I want to talk about is the keyword, and I love the example that's in the book. The French word for duck is canard, and so if you wanted to remember it, you all would think about somebody who is filling cans and with a duck standing on it, and so the duck becomes canard. It works for some people, it doesn't work for everybody. But these are tools, again, that you can use to help you improve your memory. So good luck with improving your memory for test number 2, which comes up next week on the 29th. And I will remind you that it is open for 5 days, from the 29th until December the 2nd. Okay? Sorry, December the 3rd. If you look on eLearn, it'll tell you when it closes, but it opens on the 29th of November. Okay, so if you have any questions about the test, just let me know. I will be posting a review soon, and good luck.